So for this portion of our program today, we're going to take the opportunity to do a debrief of the talk and the questions and answers that were provided. And so I will begin to my own.
Yeah, I just thought I'd raise a point that actually didn't come up in our mock talk, but sometimes faculty members ask multi-part, very convoluted questions. And it's difficult sometimes for candidates to sort of parse out the different parts of the question. I would recommend that people have a notepad that they bring with them to sort of take notes to remind them of what the questions are. And I wouldn't feel embarrassed if you've answered like 2 out of the 6 parts of the question, to ask the question or to repeat parts of the question to make sure that you're answering the question that was asked.
I'll just say a few words about, one of the questions I asked was designed to simulate the red herring, or the person who knows nothing about the speaker's topic but everything about their own. And I think what Kate did to handle that is great, to acknowledge the importance of the question. If you are familiar with the fact of there being a literature on that topic, referencing it, and saying that's something that I would enjoy exploring in future work. But it's definitely a time to acknowledge the speaker, but then pivot back to what you actually want to say, which Kate demonstrated.
So now I'm not in role of giving a mock job talk, and I will say, I think, having just recently gone through the hiring process, a few things to note. First is that one thing that happened in this simulation was that I had technical problems. Like, I couldn't figure out how to make the PowerPoint slide go. And I actually think that's pretty realistic. And so knowing in advance how the technology works, even if it's just one PowerPoint slide, is really important. So knowing, do you have the little clicker? Do you have the computer? And making sure that that works is important. One thing we were just talking about, and I'd be curious to get folks' opinion about this, is the use of PowerPoint and whether to use PowerPoint or not. I tend to think that if the PowerPoint adds some visual value to your talk, it's worth using. But if it does not add visual value, if it's just words, then I don't think it's worth using it. I think that not reading your talk would be great. I read mine because this was a simulation, but ideally you would not be reading your job talk. And then finally, one thing that I think is important, and I suspect that opinions on this vary, is the use of humor in job talks, and whether or not to because I think it's important to convey confidence, humility, and also a sense of humor if you think it's appropriate or if it reflects who you are. But I'd be curious to get folks' opinion on that.
So in terms of PowerPoint, I thought Kate's PowerPoints were just the right amount. There was a specific text you wanted to call the attention to in terms of the conditions imposed, and that sort of is memorable. It leaves an impression. But the rest of the talk was focused on her, which is how it should be. Also thought just a couple more non-substantive points. The amount of time that Kate took to answer questions was just right. I think you don't want to be too short, which might appear too dismissive, but you don't want to ramble either. So I think that was great, and I think of course the amount of time to answer depends on the question, but generally speaking, I think you don't want to be too short and too long, and that was just right. Maybe there's one thing I would change, and there might be disagreement on the panel here, but when answering questions, definitely focus on the questionnaire, but maybe kind of pan the room and look at some of the other faculty members in the audience, just to kind of see that, well, you're connecting with them. So maybe that's the only thing I would change in terms of answering questions. But overall, I thought it was a great talk. And I kind of following up on Rob's point, again, would love to also get the panel's thought, is what to do with questions that don't really make sense, or those are kind of a red herring question, but sometimes a question just doesn't really, you don't know what exactly is being asked, and is it worth asking a clarifying question? Is it just kind of answer it to the best of your ability, or rephrase it so that you're answering something? That's something I've sort of thought about as a struggle sometimes in my own presentations.
So I'm on the other side of the hiring process. I'll be participating in the hiring conference this fall, so I actually have a question more to pose, because we got a little taste of it, but kind of the nature of the simulation didn't make it quite possible to simulate, which is, what do you do when you get a question that is 100% squarely answered in the text of the article, so it's just clear the person did not read it. So we got a little bit of a taste of that, but how do you respectfully sort of go, well, it's on page 10, if you'd only read it?
So you don't say that.
Right, okay, good. I'll make a note of that.
So I have a couple of responses, and we'll start with the last one that Matthew asked. In terms of faculty who don't read, I would venture to say that most faculty will not have read the complete paper on which you are presenting. So you should assume, I think, kind of an intelligent but ignorant participant, ignorant of your particular topic. And so I think that whatever the question, you should be prepared to simply respond as though the person has not read the paper and as though the information is not in fact there. For PowerPoints, I think that to the extent that you are presenting data and charts are going to be a visual aid, I think that it's worth considering including them. So if we're talking about hiring trends, if we're talking about criminal statistics, then I think that having a visual representation as a tool may be helpful. The other thing that I think is worth noting is it's perfectly fine to say, that's a question that I haven't explored, thank you very much, and that's something that I will delve into more deeply. I hope to have the opportunity to delve in more deeply throughout my career. Because I think the worst thing that you can do is fake it. And so I think it's perfectly acceptable to say, I just haven't thought about it. And if you have resources that you would like to share with me later, I would love to hear them. For the faculty who has asked a question and you have no idea, sometimes, okay, so I did say you shouldn't fake it, but here's an instance where you might want to fake it and say, I'd have to think a little bit more deeply about the question that you're asking. Maybe after the talk, we can get together and we can explore a little bit more what your concerns are and what you were trying to get at. And then you just kind of call on somebody else quickly. The thing a couple of things I wanted to point out that I think are really good things to replicate. So I thought that Kate did a good job initially of setting out her thesis and in a very summary form identifying the 3 arguments that she was going to make. I think that that's really important to do initially because there are some faculties that will not quietly let you present for your 20 minutes that's allocated. Some faculties will jump in pretty quickly with the questioning. And so you want to be sure to take that initial 5 or 6 minutes to set forth your premise and your arguments. And then as things unfold, you will at least have done that.
I'll just make another timing point, and that is that you need to pay careful attention to the amount of time that your host tells you should be providing the paper itself, and then after that is the question. Some of the least successful talks I've attended are ones where the talk was supposed to be 15 to 20 minutes and somebody went on for a half hour, leaving very little time for questions afterwards. The faculty is going to be assessing your presentation largely on the basis of how you respond to questions, and they want to make sure that they have enough time to give you a fair number of questions. So if you cheat them on the time they have to ask questions, it's not going to go over well. In response to Dmitry's point about the mystifying question, one possible approach, if it's possible to even discern the inkling of a question, would be to say something like, well, if I understand your question correctly, and then sort of restate your understanding of the question and respond, and then you can add, if I misunderstood, I'm happy to get some clarification from you.
Another point, I have given a job talk and had a person on the faculty insist that nowhere in my paper had I addressed a point, and really press it with me to the point where I finally said, well, I acknowledge it is in the footnotes and I can show you where it is, and maybe we might, I think I said something about maybe we disagree with the reading of the sources that I provided to address that point, and then again, sort of try to follow up later. So I have had that happen, and just as we're talking, it has made me think that I've been on several faculties, and the people on the faculty who are listening to the speaker know each other well. They also know to expect that there will be the person who asks the mystifying question, and they know who that will be. There will be the person who asks the question out of left field. There will be the person who has read every footnote and wants to go into them. And so one thing to consider is that the question that you're getting as the speaker, it may be a very typical thing that person does for everybody. And just, I don't know if that's reassuring to consider that the faculty that is your audience also knows that. And so if there's somebody who's always just pushy, well, they're probably just pushy. And so it's not necessarily something personal that's going wrong with your own job talk as much as just part of the personality of the faculty that the faculty as a whole will be very forgiving of the speaker because they understand, oh, this personality is speaking to our speaker. So I just wanted to make that point too. All of the faculties tend to have personalities who reveal themselves in those talks.
So if you were going to identify 3 things that you think a candidate must convey in this hour, what would the 3 things be? What do you want the faculty to lead with?
I would say confidence would be one thing. I would say open-mindedness, not shutting out possible criticisms and suggestions. Those would be 2.
Intellectual curiosity and approachability, not just somebody, how they're going to be as a scholar, but how they're going to be as a teacher is something I think faculty look for.
And how, I would just add to that, how they'd be as a colleague too. I think that open-minded, sort of riffing off of open-mindedness, I would also say being able to have a conversation. So I think that I was under the impression that I had to get every question right, that I couldn't not know the answer to a question. But I think I quickly learned that people weren't expecting me to have 100% accurate answers. They just wanted to see that I was thinking about the issues, that I could engage on the issues, that I could have a conversation about the issues. And that's ultimately, I think, what was more important than knowing the perfect answer, was being able to demonstrate an ability to have a conversation with other people about a topic that you really care about. The other thing that I think is hasn't been mentioned yet is that I think I went into this expecting, and maybe it's because I come from the world of being a public defender where everyone was always yelling at me, but I expected it to be, there to be mean questions, and there really weren't for the most part. Every now and then I'd sort of get the off-the-wall question or the question that I honestly couldn't understand, but I just have to say it felt very nice to have all these people asking about this topic that I really care about and taking the time to think about it. And so I really appreciated how actually, for the most part, very friendly the conversations were.
I do want to reinforce Emily's point about teaching, because some candidates come in, excuse me, with a lot of classroom experience, but some don't. And for the faculty who are evaluating, that's the only thing we have to go on is your performance during the job talk. So for those candidates in particular, it might be important to think about how they come off as a potential teacher and not just a scholar. And again, some candidates come with a lot of teaching experience and have evaluations and so on. The other thing I would add, kind of procedural more than substantive, but who is keeping the queue? And maybe personalities come into play in that sense. When people want to ask a question, they want to get called on, and they might feel, that you missed them or something like that. If you're keeping the queue yourself as a candidate, it's again important to be equitable about it. Make sure you don't forget anybody in the back. Or you can just ask your host to keep the queue, in which case you don't have to worry about it. Again, faculties differ. Some will ask you to keep the queue yourself, and some will have a host. Usually it's a host, but not always. And it's important to know that coming in and just to have the expectation of that.
The last thing I was going to ask is if you have an opinion about whether you thank someone for their question, or the first thing out of your mouth after a question is asked.
Our inclination is always to fill the silence. And I would recommend practicing taking a moment before you leap into the question and fill the silence. And I say that because it gives you a chance to gather yourself, and also because when you're in the classroom, there are instances where you will have to become comfortable with silence as students begin to process what it is you really want from them. So I think you don't always want to say, that's a really interesting question. That's a really interesting question. That's a really interesting question. You do want to have some phrases that are handy, but I also think it's fine to say, if this is what you're asking me, here's my initial response. So thank you again. I think that we have addressed many of the points that we wanted to address, and hopefully we've given you some strategies for managing difficult situations should they arise during the course of your callback. Again, we have lots of information that's on the website about the whole faculty hiring process. So look us up, aals.org. Thanks.